Thanks, Jacob. I should say that, yes, it did take me a long time to write the book because it's such a difficult concept, public and private, but it was greatly helped by many people in this room and being in this room on other occasions, as some of you might notice when you look at the bibliography. But I want to start in the 1970s, which is, I think, a really key moment for discussions on privacy and private life. You'll notice it's pre-Mark Zuckerberg and pre the internet. But in the early 1970s, the British Parliament debated a right to privacy no fewer than 13 times before Labour Home Secretary James Callaghan appointed a royal commission to investigate the issue as to whether we needed privacy law reform. This is quite a novel idea in Britain. It was very much considered privacy was part of the national character. Minding your own business was kind of in a British person's DNA, but a number of things had changed. The first call came from an MP called Alexander Lyon in the House of Commons in 1967, and he called for a right to be let alone if one wishes to be left alone. He called for a right to privacy bill. He was echoing quite deliberately Bostonian lawyers Warren and Brandeis, who had written the most famous article in privacy's history. This was in 1890. They're Victorians who are concerned about urbanisation, a sort of ending of a kind of culture of deference, and the yellow press, a sort of very strong media that's interested in gossip. And Henry James and Edith Wharton are among the writers who are decrying the end of public and private, the dissolution of the border. This is something that is often, like privacy, its death has been heralded many times. But Alexander Lyon in the House of Commons is echoing this idea. He's talking about the right to be let alone. He says, in a civilized community where we are living on top of each other, there must be an area of life which an individual has the right to keep to himself. He called for a right to privacy that would protect any person from unreasonable and serious interference with the seclusion of himself, his family, or his property from the public. While he was mainly worried about media intrusion, concern had started popping up in the newspapers about wiretapping and listening devices. Beyond the erosion of private space for individuals, new technology was increasingly being seen and discussed in Big Brother terms as surveilling the population. Indeed, the idea of surveillance society was first used in the US in the early 1970s, a concern memorably depicted in that film with Gene Hackman, The Conversation, where he is a wiretapper who misunderstands and in fact is tricked and makes a terrible mistake. But that sort of speaks to a kind of paranoia and anxiety around wiretapping of the era. So the Younger Report is what followed this Royal Commission, and it achieved nothing in terms of legislation. It was never going to. Britain's not a very sort of legal bound society, unlike the US, but it did amount to quite an interesting evolution in the definition of privacy. Now, privacy is a protean concept. It means different things at different times. If you go back to something like the 17th century, it's seen as quite a dangerous thing, a threat. Only murderers and adulterers would want privacy, said one preacher, very different to Warren and Brandeis calling for it. In relation to its definition, the Younger Report's authors wrote, "We have conceived of the right of privacy of having two main aspects. The first of these is freedom from intrusion upon oneself, one's home, family and relationships. The second is privacy of information. That is, the right to determine for oneself how and to what extent information about oneself is communicated to others." So you have this sort of bifurcation. The members of the Younger Commission had been actually surprised when it called for evidence that members of the public, when solicited for their views, hadn't written in. They received a number of letters, but nothing significant. So they conducted a survey of British public attitudes, which revealed a generational divide over the definition of privacy. Those aged 45 and over described privacy as keeping your own private affairs to yourself, other people minding their own business, and freedom from nosy parkers. The home, in the words of the 17th century jurist Edward Coke and the 18th century Prime Minister William Pitt was a castle. However, the younger generation that had come of age in the 60s and 70s were much more likely to define privacy as leading your life as you want to lead it, doing what you like at home, and living as you want to. For them, privacy was sort of discussed in terms of self-actualization, rather than a defence against unwelcome intrusion, interference and scrutiny. There was no mention for this cohort of the right to be let alone. In the end, the Younger report did not address the first part of privacy, the freedom from intrusion. Family privacy, in fact, is hardly mentioned. In 207 pages, one of the very few references that mention family privacy is from the testimony of British Council of Churches. But actually this wasn't to defend it. Instead, the British Council of Churches criticised the undue obsession with the personal or family privacy of the earlier part of the century because of what it might be concealing, or because of the community nature of the church. In fact, more than a definitional change, and more than a kind of sort of being more interested in informational privacy rather than a kind of family life, what you actually had in the Younger report was a sort of creeping sense that privacy was a problem. In fact, they talk about excessive privacy as being an issue. The Younger Committee had been set up to investigate the possibility of the legal right to privacy, but concluded it could be, with too much privacy, the result is likely to be loneliness, estrangement from society, and the growth of secretiveness and introversion. What you had here in this bifurcation isn't just a kind of semantic discussion. It's really the separation of the concept of privacy, which had been formed in the Victorian period in this particular form, from private life. And so privacy has started to be turned into the sort of discussion we've seen today, which is around information, data, control of information, and the idea of private life somewhere separate, not just from the state, but from kind of the public, somewhere separate from public life, was seen to be as almost a problem. A number of kind of social and political trends has started already to see private life as a problem. Radical feminists had argued that privacy could be a right for men to abuse women. As Catherine McKinnon would later write, the personal is political. No, as Catherine McKinnon would later write, privacy law is a right to beat women in their home. You had the radical feminist Carol Hanisch talk about the personal as political, which worked on the basis that examining and opening up the private sphere would help lead to liberation. Kate Millett, who wrote The Explosive Sexual Politics in the early 70s, drew on the authoritarian personality, a work in personality theory, in which thinkers in the Frankfurt School attributed authoritarian tendencies to socialization, to argue that the family unit was a wellspring of oppression and repression. Indeed, at the end of the 60s, Edmund Leach, then Provost of King's College, delivered the prestigious Reith Lectures on BBC Radio 4. And he was talking about the then problem of teenage rebellion. In a crowded lecture hall, he pointed his finger at the home. Rather than accepting soppy propaganda about the virtue of a united family life, he said, the reality was different. Far from being the basis of a good society, the family, with its narrow privacy and tawdry secrets, is a source of all our discontents. Now, this is a fairly common idea. We hear it fairly often. It's not new, but it was controversial then and not so much mainstream. I was really struck reading about patients who went to the Tavistock Mental Health Clinic, pioneering mental health clinic known for its contributions to psychotherapy. And they were asked upon attendance this question on the clinic's application form, which was, did you experience any special difficulties or changes in the home during your early years? What impact, basically, did your family have on your life? And patients didn't answer that question. They left it blank initially. When patients described their family life as happy or united, that lovely psychiatrist R.D. Laing dismissed that as a stereotypical idealization. So what we have here is a sort of beginnings of an elite concern about kind of data privacy in relation to restricting the press, then in particular tabloid press, anxieties about new technologies, which have always triggered anxieties about privacy. That kind of disguises the end of private life. The end of private life is something bounded and valued. You see then the birth of privacy and the death of private life. So this period, the 1970s, I would argue, saw the dissolution of the border between public and private after numerous processes over the 20th century either intruded in or made their own way out of the private realm into the public, a traversing from both sides, which has major implications today for how we live in our political life, in our social life, and in our intimate life. You see politics without boundaries, intensely personal politics, states that never quite know where its borders begin or end, the absence of civil society, and changing social norms and the devaluing of intimacy. So what I want to try and do in kind of two parts is look a little bit at the beginnings of the public and private realm and what I mean by them. These are abstract concepts. Academics can write far too much about them. Various different models are often posited. You know, the economic model, the division between government, administration and free markets. I just want to look at something very sort of a little bit simpler, set aside those sort of complex discussions and look at the more direct question, which is how European attitudes towards the desire for a private life and its separation from a public life changed and emerged over time. I used to think when I started this that it would probably begin in property. You know, the English have and their property laws around the home. An Englishman's home is his castle. These are not unimportant things. But I actually found that it's much more a battle over the mind, really. I mean, you know, if you think back to the early 17th century, people were taught this: task yourself even in private, especially in private, because privacy can become your enemy. Whether you're in your chambers or private closets, whether you're hidden from human eyes, remember that God's eyes are always upon you. Do nothing in private that you wouldn't do in public. I really like thinking about that phrase. Do nothing in private you wouldn't do in public. And this would apply to somebody rich or poor in a castle or you know, living under a shack. The sense that you didn't have a kind of different life in private. It shaped, you know, in a highly religious society, it's not just sort of for religious people, it's for everybody. But Europe obviously didn't stay this way. And that begins accidentally, almost kind of unconsciously, really with the development, a tentative development and a changing idea of what conscience is. Conscience to follow religious conscience. The key turning point, or one turning point, is the Protestant Reformation. When Luther challenged the Catholic Church's authority, the universal church as it was, he didn't intend to champion personal freedom. His authority that he turned to was Scripture, the Word. But by challenging the universal church and removing intermediaries, he accidentally opened the door to authorising the self. And he wasn't the only one who is involved in this. He wasn't trying to start a private life. In fact, probably the opposite. He used to write to people telling them not to be on their own. And obviously Protestants and later Puritans were very invasive of any sort of private sphere. They got rid of confession apart from anything else. But the focus on Scripture and reading probably cultivated an interiority. The focus with a direct relationship with God probably cultivated a sort of a kind of growing sense of individual conscience, not least because it was tested. And it was tested a number of times, particularly in interesting ways in England under Henry VIII, who, in a fit of pique, declares himself the head of the English Church and demands his subjects swear loyalty. Now, this is a massive change for all subjects in England. They and all men had to basically sign up to his position as head of the church, which effectively means demoting the Pope, sign up to his marriage to Anne Boleyn and the success of her future children. although obviously that didn't quite go to plan. And you can read the writings of people at the time. So this is an age which demanded public conformity. You had to sign up. Lying, swearing was a sin. God needed to hear the truth. John Forrest, a Franciscan friar, decided to swear an oath to Henry, but privately, he noted, "I denied the Bishop of Rome with my outward man, but not my inward man." I denied the Bishop of Rome with my outward man, but not my inward man. So he's making a division privately in his own mind between what he says publicly and what he says privately. And that was verboten. Henry's men were on the lookout for people who basically dissimulated. This split between public speech and private thought became crucial in people's ordinary lives, and it threw up political questions which the thinkers of the day would wrestle with. Thomas Hobbes later responded to this question in Leviathan, arguing that while subjects must publicly conform to maintain order, they could privately think what they want. Thought is free, he argued. And later, with toleration, we saw the establishment of a private sphere to tame religion, really, one that permitted relative religious differences. It was a way of dealing with the bloodshed and the challenges, really, to authority, to let people sort of worship in private the way they saw fit. And I said, it's relative. Sorry about the Catholics. It's just the way it goes. But they realised religious disputes couldn't be solved by forcing conformity, so they were permitted under toleration. Now, this wasn't like a positive step towards a private sphere, but it did develop in relation to ideas about authority, where its borders lay, how far it could intervene into your mind or not, but also the idea of the self. And there's, obviously this interesting discussion between Hobbes and Locke about what the human being is, what the self is. But John Locke held that God wanted sincere consciences and that the state should treat citizens as a rational subject. The self, he says, was that conscious thinking thing, fully aware of pleasure and pain and largely concerned for itself. That gives way to the 18th century. And in fact, the interesting thing about the 18th century is it's a time that Adam Ferguson aptly describes as an age of separations. And this is where you get this sort of delineation between public and private. The ideas about conscience, which were originally confined to ideas about religion, enter quite quickly into people's decisions about their intimate relations. So up until this point, fornication is illegal. In 1640, Susan Bounty is hanged for adultery. She's not one of many, but it's a pretty restrictive climate in the way in which people can conduct their intimate lives. 18th century, you see this sort of period of relaxation, and people start talking about conscience in terms of sexual morality. Consider this case of James Boswell's affair, and he had many, and he wrote about it in his voluminous diaries. He has an affair with a married woman called Jean Hume. When he attempts in a kind of, every now and again he has kind of anxieties about whether he's giving in to all his lust. In this case, he sort of tries to end this relationship with this married woman. She told him that she was unwilling to let go of their delicious pleasures, explaining that she loved her husband as a husband and Boswell as a lover. She declared, "My conscience does not reproach me, and I'm sure that God cannot be offended by them." People start talking about lust as to whether it's a natural emotion. David Hume weighs in. It's not that everybody kind of has no sexual morality, but they are thinking about these questions, and they're thinking about them in kind of modern ways. It's a really exciting time when you look back on it, and obviously there's always a danger of idealising it. But the public square kind of just really takes off. You have a collapse of the licensing laws. So newspapers are being published at an incredibly quick rate in a time when, prior to that point, they just didn't exist. So information is kind of circulating in society. Coffee houses become the place where people go and get a lot of their information. They look at the newspapers here, but they initially are kind of set up around particular interests. People need to know about what's happening at sea. It's a rising mercantile society. So are their interests safe? It soon expands to discussions about theatre and the idea of kind of criticism. These spaces were premised on Enlightenment ideas, the belief that social interaction and rational inquiry were inherently social goods. Samuel Johnson, the prolific scholar whose Lives of the Poets was commissioned in a coffee house, praised the ready man of conversational society over the scholar buried in his manuscripts who considered ideas to be uncontestable truths. People start talking about how to behave with each other, about manners. There's a sense in which being together in society, you polish off the worst excesses of each other. Polish becomes the word, is taken from the French, and it's developed into the idea of politeness. So politeness seems a bit passive-aggressive now, but then people are thinking about how do we deal with strangers? We don't know who these merchants are. After the Civil War, how do we talk to each other without getting into some really bad arguments? How do we deal with each other? The handshake is developed. Initially as a way of sealing deals, but it becomes kind of common practice, a nice step away from the curtsying and bowing that went before. The key point is that simultaneously, as this is happening, the private sphere is developing, and both become conscious of these, people become newly conscious of these categories. So by the 1730s, the phrase public opinion, a term hardly used before, peppers the public discourse. And there's a sense in which, with the development of this bourgeois public sphere, it's a social realm separate from the state, composed of financially secure individuals whose social relations transcend the boundaries of their personal lives, and they begin to come together as a public, aware of themselves increasingly as a social force. And as all that is happening, you do get a kind of hammering out of private spaces in the domestic sphere. The household becomes increasingly separated from the market. People buy things rather than make them in their own home. The corridor is introduced over some time. But I think one of the most transformative in the way we try and think about the private is actually one of the most important phenomena is actually the development of the novel, which displays the virtues of the private sphere on the page. Critics like Samuel Johnson discussing Samuel Richardson's Pamela, which is an unreadable novel now, but 800 pages, but it's about a servant girl who, and it's told through letters, who writes home about she's got her master is predatory. He finally reads her letters, in which he sees her true, authentic self, unvarnished, the sort of self that she shows only to her parents, and he falls in love with her, and she falls in love with him, and it's a happy story in the end. It seems sort of the emotions on the page really struck Europe at the time. So Samuel Johnson talks about the knowledge of the heart that's in the novel, and praised how Richardson had revealed the inner mechanism rather than the broader clock face, the inner mechanism of the broader clock face. So the novel became this sort of laboratory, really, shifting from the stage, exploring the moral complexities, and key to the point is the sort of the value of the private sphere, the value of the private self, emotion, and this almost burgeoning sense of authenticity being with the private. But at this stage, both spheres, I think you could say, are seen as valuable. And I think it's important to keep that kind of relationship in mind between public and private. Because often when we talk about discussions, when we talk about the private, we just talk about the private area, but we don't see how it's in relationship with the public and how one actually relies on the other. That brings us briefly to the Victorians, which I think idealised privacy almost as a national value. Many criticisms at the time, and rightly so, that it was almost the private had overtaken the public, and the public realm, this realm of sign of industrialisation with the building of empire, was a realm of harsh strangers. But you begin to see commuting and leisure time develop, and an idealisation of the domestic sphere and the family. But it was very much the case that what went on behind closed doors was respected by culture and by law, although there are some interesting tensions with the way in which it's valued so highly that then also invites kind of intervention in. I think to a large degree that's also important is there was a reliance upon civil society to kind of socialise the next generation, so churches and philanthropists and often middle class women who kind of be an intermediary between the state and the family. That kind of, those intermediaries and the public is what I think is missing from many of the discussions today about the fall of private life. So it was widely observed from the 1970s that there had been a shift in really character to a degree. So people were beginning to be much more open in culture. You have these two documentaries, one, the Wilkins, the family, which is about the Wilkins family in the 1970s, a family which basically opens the door to a documentary maker called Paul Watson, who comes in and films their lives. And he says to them, this is going to be an amazing, a tremendous invasion of your privacy. And Margaret Wilkins says, well, basically bring it on, because this is what real life is like. It's not like those television programs. It's not like those films where everybody's kitchens are clean. Real life is like this. So that begins to get some sort of social commentary. And I just want to talk about that kind of social commentary. One response to it is Tom Wolfe, who writes this wonderful, searing, critical article in the New Yorker magazine. And the cover of the magazine is a bunch of people all pointing to themselves saying, me. He's basically saying, you know, we've basically got a self-obsessed, narcissistic, although he doesn't use that term, generation of people. He blames it on a kind of cult of individualism. The individual, as we've heard over this weekend, has kind of just gone too far, become too self-obsessed. He's too strong, and he's kind of shaken off all the responsibilities. So he blames it on this kind of excessive individual. Richard Sennett is also writing at this time, and you may know his work, The Fall of Public Man, a really excellent description, and it's much more about sort of the city and urban life. But he looks at the kind of what he describes as the way in which intimate life and intimate society is now much more public, and he sort of describes it as the private overtaking the public. And then you have Christopher Lasch, who is often referred to in these conferences, but I think his is a really useful way of looking at the end of private life. So the key point of his book, A Culture of Narcissism, is the subtitle, which is In an Age of Diminishing Expectations. So he is talking about things like the end of religion, but he's also talking about the end of kind of collective politics and a kind of survivalism that exists in a society that has become scared of its own future, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis or environmentalism. There's this kind of insecurity that he is describing. In that context, in that sort of erosion, if you like, of roots and wings, he writes the following: it made sense to live only for the moment and to fix our eyes on our own private performance, to become connoisseurs of our own decadence, to cultivate transcendental self-attention. So he's seeing that the individuals are not, as Wolfe would describe, a kind of confident, strong individual. Actually, the individual is what Lasch would later describe as a minimal self that requires recognition. It's constantly seeking this sort of there's almost a sense that it exists, constantly over looking out. Just as a sidebar, there are a couple of mentions of the discussions around abortion in contemporary life, but it's here that you get people who previously thought of it as a private issue but were against it, many religious people, going much more into the public square and arguing against it. So it becomes part of the sort of culture wars, really. So Episcopalians, evangelicals in the States previously kept it private, and they were open to it as almost like public policy. But that begins to end then, and the kind of abortion becomes kind of caught up here in the culture wars. I'm not going to mention how it became a privacy right, because that's a whole different sidebar. But it wasn't an advance for abortion rights. So where does that leave us today? So first, I would say all the descriptions I'm talking about in terms of the end of private life, as in the dissolution of the border between public and private, happened before the internet. Right? They happened before digital technology. You have the kind of diminishing of public life, the overvaluing almost of the private individual, the private domestic person, but one which is no longer kind of protected in its own space. Today, I think that kind of disillusion between public and private affects most of our lives in many ways. If we look at the political sphere, it's extremely personal. Politics seems to be all about the personality of people. It's very difficult to have kind of political discussions, to kind of distance the man from the policy. I think that's got to be something to do with the way in which the personal is political, kind of inverted politics and the private. The state doesn't seem to know where its borders end. And I don't mean that kind of literally in terms of the border, people coming in, although maybe there's something there. There are constant interventions from the state into the private. So a few examples of this would be, and I pick on Scotland because it's most egregious, but some very useful examples would be something like the Named Person Act, which never quite got through, but the informal form because people challenged it. The Named Person Act would have had every child have a named person, but like a teacher, or they were a bit unclear who this person was going to be. But the teacher or this named person would be responsible for the well-being of the child. And what's interesting about this is that it can't be very good for child protection, because there are children who are at risk, but this isn't about that. This is more a sort of, almost like a sort of therapeutic reaching out to try and kind of connect the state to every single person, and a displacement, clearly, of the parent and the family. That almost like suggests that's a kind of, the therapeutic model is a very different sense of the individual there, somebody that needs constant support for everything in their lives. So that's the state. It's not like this sort of, the way in which some people describe it as this kind of big brother, totalitarian, constantly watching us. It's almost like wondering who we are, yes, and trying to kind of connect with people. I think one of the biggest things that's difficult to describe is the absence of civil society. I think you did see it, though, the real absence of civil society during COVID. But I was struck thinking about the work of Robert Putnam, the political scientist who wrote about the decline of civil society in 2000 or so. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And his central argument was that American civil society has been declining since the 1960s. He documented how participation in civic organizations, community groups, and social activities had dramatically decreased, using the metaphor that while more Americans were bowling alone than ever before, they were bowling alone. So he was looking at like these, the religious groups, the Knights of Columbus, labor unions, parent-teacher organization, Federation Women's Club, League of Women Voters, military veteran voters. So these sort of intermediary institutions that are kind of organized from top down, but also bottom up. When that book was published, there was a lot of kind of hand-wringing about it. People started talking about social capital, these slightly odd terms, social capital, community building. All of that was top down and kind of empty, but it was taken seriously. So there was a sense that there is a problem. His latest book, The Upswing, how he came together a century ago and how he can do it again, just was like I don't know if anybody's heard of it. You can't even find it. It's not even on his Wikipedia page. So I was trying to find the exact title this morning. So that kind of discussion, it's almost like it no longer matters, or rather it's turned into something else, which is, I think you can see it there was a book published by Norina Hertz, an economist. It's called The Lonely Century, A Call to Reconnect, and that received a little bit more interest. And she has the great revelation that loneliness is astonishingly damaging to our health. It triggers a lingering and cumulative stress response in the body, hampering our immune systems, increasing our risk of heart disease, stroke, and dementia, making us almost 30% more likely to die prematurely. So we should obviously be inviting Jacob out for a drink. But that idea of loneliness is something I think we all understand. It's sort of been social policy-ified, right? There is such a thing as loneliness. There's also such a thing as kind of community breakdown. But what I think she's doing is pathologizing a social problem and turning it into a problem of individual psychology, which of course needs more kind of individual, kind of almost like a therapeutic approach rather than a kind of, rather than rebuilding society. And finally, I think it has obviously, the breakdown has had implications for both social norms and intimacy. And so I'm going to leave you with one example of this. It's really dreadful, but it kind of gets those 2 points together and kind of elaborates a little bit more on the way people talk about privacy and private life. So there's this couple in the States called Joe Gow and Carmen Wilson. They're nice liberal professors in their early 60s. One's a psychiatrist, and the other's like a chancellor at Wisconsin University, or he was until last year. So they make films of their sex life, and not only that, they talk about and do cooking on these programs as well. She's a vegan, and so it's like this sort of weird humanizing thing. Okay. It's their private thing. They make their own films, but they decided to put them online. And when they weren't taking off on OnlyFans, which is a peculiar thing anyway, they put them on Pornhub, and somehow somebody sees who he is, and he is subsequently sacked. And there's a big scandal, and the free speech people defend him, and it's discussed in terms of, doesn't he have the free speech to do it? Here, their justification though is this: they're doing nothing wrong. They love each other. What's wrong? They love each other. And I was really struck by this, because I think you've got two types of kind of invasion of privacy, if you like. One is the what am I trying to say? That it's not like it's the invasion of privacy. You've almost got this sort of deliberate shamelessness, which is almost like a Diogenes in the market square. And I would say things like pride is a bit like that, why there are people who are trying to challenge that boundary and putting the private stuff that really should be private out. And they're doing it almost like punks. And then you've got the other kind, which is this sort of, they're just indifferent to the fact that there are some things which are actually better done in private and take on different meanings when they're in public. And it's that indifference that I'm most interested in, because I think it's a sort of casual, almost just don't see that there's any separation between what should be done in public and what should be done in private. I said at the beginning that many of these sort of changes between public and private do evolve with ideas of the self. So what's happening here? One is a sort of self that needs protection, that needs caring. That's a sort of therapeutic, safe self. But the other is almost like an animalistic self, where the kind of the human qualities are being abandoned. So that's my optimistic end. Thank you very much.